The Empire, while younger than the Federation, is easily the equal of its historic rival in terms of scale and resources. The key social distinction between the two powers is that slavery in the Empire is legal, a fact that has remained a source of controversy since its inception, both within the Empire and without. Some observers have pointed out, however, that conditions for those at the lowest levels of feudal society are far worse than those experienced by imperial slaves. The popular image of the Empire is one of opulence, but while pomp and pageantry may be the norm in the core imperial systems, elsewhere in imperial space, one can find myriad examples of deprivation and squalor. Indeed, the Empire encompasses many striking contrasts. Sophisticated technology exists alongside an ancient Roman system of government, and the affluence of the core worlds depends on often unregulated slave labor in the wretched outer colonies. Ruthless industrial efficiency and low taxation has made the Empire rich and mighty. The hierarchy of imperial society is rigid, but a citizen can always rise through the ranks if he or she becomes wealthy enough and makes the right connections. Even a slave could, in theory, become a senator. History. The Achenar colony was founded. In the mid-23rd century, wealthy entrepreneur Marlene Duval was so frustrated with the federal government that she founded an independent colony of her own in the Achenar system, chosen for its remoteness. When Marlene was killed shortly afterwards in a flyer accident, her brother Henson Duval took over as ruler. Henson Duval the Emperor. Duval immediately abolished the fledgling democracy that Marlene had set up, and in its place he established a system modelled on ancient Rome. He was now emperor, and his closest allies were his senators. Any colonists who might have objected were forced into silent compliance with Duval's vision. Such were his wealth and power. It was also widely believed that Marlene Duval, like Remus in ancient Rome, had been killed by her own brother. Nobody dared to speak out. The Mudlark Extinction. The colonists were aware that the planet they had settled, Achenar 6D, had indigenous life, but at first it wasn't appreciated that this included a sentient species. Nicknamed the Mudlarks after they were observed digging through riverbank mud in search of food. Although the Mudlarks were at a pre-agricultural stage of development, they appear to have developed the beginnings of language. They also created crude forms in molded clay, with no obvious practical purpose, possibly indicating a nascent artistic culture. The Mudlarks proved fatally vulnerable to the bacteria carried by the colonists, and within a few decades of the colony's founding, the species was extinct. Rumors subsequently emerged that Henson Duval had purposefully removed all traces of the Mudlarks, partly in fear of federal reprisal and partly to ensure that his development plans would not be hindered by ecological constraints. The Federation attempted to reclaim Achenar. When the federal government heard rumors that Duval's colony had recklessly caused the destruction of a sentient indigenous species, they decided on military intervention. The Imperial ships beat back the federal attackers, who were unable to establish a beachhead among the airless outer worlds, and struggled to maintain supply lines so far from Earth. The federal forces eventually fell back and entrenched in the Beta Hydri system. Skirmishes with Imperial ships continued for the next 50 years, but these were unable to prevent Duval from expanding the Empire to many other worlds. The Age of Expansion. After hostilities with the Federation ceased, the Empire entered a century of growth, annexing many new systems and persuading others to join. It spent the following 2 centuries consolidating its new territory, appointing colonial administrators from among the noble houses of Achenar. Society. An ancient Roman model. The Empire works on a clean system. Society is divided into tiers: Emperor, senators, patrons, clients, and then citizens, with slaves below these. Groups of patrons pledge their support to a given senator, offering military service, tax revenue, and the right to wield the patron's votes in the Senate on their behalf. In return, the patrons are granted a measure of protection and material security, as well as having their interests represented in the Imperial Senate. Senators are responsible for deciding tax rates and welfare systems for their patrons, meaning that the lower a given senator's tax rates, the more patrons he is likely to attract. This is far from being a patron's only concern, however. Loyalty over time, ideological compatibility, family connections, and discreet private deals can all play a part in deciding which senator to back. The system extends downward through the tiers in a similar fashion, with clients pledging themselves to given patrons, and citizens pledging themselves to given clients. The votes held by the patrons actually comprise the total votes of all the clients pledged to them. Similarly, the votes held by those clients comprise the total votes of their pledged citizens. Patrons are therefore capable of investing variable degrees of power in their chosen senators, with the result that some senators are more powerful than others. Senators are responsible for those below them, meaning that everyone has a form of social security, at least in theory. Indeed, many senators take pride in the security they offer their citizens. Some have even been known to drain material wealth from small independent worlds and pump it back into the capital economy, allowing them to reduce citizens' taxes and giving their own popularity a considerable boost. Patrons are free to withdraw their patronage from their chosen senator, placing the onus on the senator to represent them satisfactorily or face a loss of voting power. Rigid stratification. The division between social classes is formal, unambiguous, and strict. But there is a clear path to advancement. A person can pay a fee and petition for admittance to the rank above. In this way, slaves can become citizens too. The law is not the same for all. Senators have a responsibility to enforce the law, and they must obey the emperor's decree, but are otherwise above the law. A senator can even carry out executions personally with little, if any, fear of consequence. Military, the Imperial Navy. Maintaining a modernized navy has always been a top priority for the Empire. The ever-present threat posed by the Federation has driven previous emperors to empty the coffers again and again, for fear of being outstripped in the arms race. More recently, funding has come from wealthy individual senators, many of whom are all too eager to gain influence within the Navy. Indeed, it has been claimed that devastating planetary mining has been carried out in order to further this cause. The Facisi system is arguably the most significant Imperial naval base. Many officers are housed on the world of Topaz, while Peter's Rec is home to the training centers. As well as the battle fleets, the Imperial Navy maintains a subdivision dedicated to exploring the fringes of known space. The Emperor's Own. Genetic engineering is not officially tolerated in the Empire, but it does sometimes take place. One notable example is the Emperor's Own, a group of genetically engineered super soldiers deployed during the shock invasion of Mansfield Colony in the Leadler system in 2959. They proved brutally efficient, overrunning the federal defenses in a mere 2 hours and inflicting a rare defeat upon a federal Gurkha regiment. Culture and values. The human body represents perfection. This belief, once held with near religious intensity, still forms the bedrock of the Empire's culture and morals. Genetic modification is frowned upon, but a degree of genetic correction is known to take place, supposedly to correct defects such as vulnerability to certain diseases. The belief in the sanctity of the human body originates with the first emperor, Henson de Val. While he did not claim to be literally descended from the gods in the manner of Roman emperors of old, he declared that his own image was the paradigm to which others ought to aspire. Households across the empire were required to display a statue or bust of the emperor in a place of honor. Imperial citizens are therefore expected to shun habits that corrupt or defile the human body, such as excessive indulgence in narcotics. The ownership of slaves, by contrast, is tolerated in the same way that the ownership of any beautiful work of art is tolerated. Mistreatment of slaves is thus akin to vandalism. Keeping one's own body in peak condition and adorning it with jewels and expensive clothes is not vanity, but duty. And owning well-treated slaves is also considered a sign of good character. The emperor's word is supreme. The emperor's successor is decided by the Senate, although the Duval dynasty has such a strong power base that the imperial throne has only ever been occupied by members of that bloodline. For generations, genetic selection ensured that the emperor's heir would be male, and the current ruler, Arissa Lavinie Duval, is the first woman to hold the throne. Marlene Duval is sometimes described as the empire's first female ruler, but this is incorrect. The colony she founded was a democracy. Honor is everything. The value placed on honor is a constant throughout all tiers of imperial society. Honor can be lost through various means, including leaving debts unpaid, failing to respect a superior or provide for a dependent, breaking a solemn vow, conducting combat with cowardly weapons such as nerve gas, and defiling one's own body. Slavery is acceptable, but slaves must be well treated. In the Empire, it is not uncommon for the poor and disenfranchised to sign up for a period of military service in exchange for a small sum of money. A similar logic applies to imperial slavery, to the extent that someone might sell themselves into slavery to clear a debt and restore their honor. Selling oneself into slavery is a straightforward legal process and results in a guaranteed sum of money for one's family, so it is a popular option for the desperate. In practice, however, many find that it takes much longer than expected to clear their debts. People are also forced into slavery against their will. Sometimes a senator will sentence a person of lower rank to be stripped of citizenship and designated as a slave, but it is more common to impose a fine of such magnitude that the citizen has no recourse but to sell his or herself into slavery. Slaves may also be taken prisoner following a conflict, abducted from their home, or even captured in a hijacking. While trading slaves is lawful everywhere in the Empire, except on Emerald, taking new slaves outside of wartime is illegal without the blessing of a senator. Diplomatic relations. The Federation. Resentment of the Federation runs deep in the Empire. The superpower is remembered as an oppressive, interfering force that hypocritically avoids inflicting the slightest harm on non-human life, but thinks nothing of forcibly imposing its values on its fellow humans, and lacking the freedoms and social customs that the Empire values so dearly. While open hostility has frequently been the case in the past, the current situation is one of grudging coexistence beneath which mistrust simmers. Despite this antipathy, the Empire cooperated with the Federation in a series of joint initiatives against the Thargoids in the early 3300s. The Alliance. When the Alliance was founded in 3230, following a bitter conflict with the Empire and the Federation, multiple systems defected to it from both superpowers. To the surprise of many, the Empire took very little further retributive action, partly because of the ill health of the Emperor of the time, and partly due to a belief that the defecting systems would return to their natural home, sooner or later. The Empire's current attitude to the Alliance is one of studied contempt. To recognize it as a threat would be too much like showing respect. Internal politics. Unsurprisingly for a society so concerned with rank and influence, the Empire contains a multitude of feuding power blocks. In particular, there is a good deal of bad blood between the various noble houses, whose values range from hardcore traditionalist to staunch reformist. The Imperial Senate is no longer as overshadowed by the Emperor as it once was, and has gained sufficient strength to act as a counterbalance to the Emperor's political will. The individual character of the Emperor still determines the Empire's overall direction, however, and the suggestion that the Empire should evolve out of its old ways has proven deeply divisive. The Alliance. Introduction. The Alliance is the youngest of the galaxy's three superpowers, and is perhaps best understood in terms of what it chooses not to be. It rejects both the extreme capitalism of the Federation and the rigid hierarchy of the Empire, choosing instead a third way of voluntary association for mutual benefit. The desire for freedom from interference, both from external threats and internal bureaucracy, was the key motivation behind the Alliance's founding and is enshrined in its Articles of Association. The governments of the member systems are given as much autonomy to create their own laws and administer their own affairs as possible. The right to political self-determination and cultural self-expression are essential to the Alliance, but it remains to be seen whether the ultimate result will be stable harmony or a cacophony of dissenting voices. Every Alliance member knows that alliances have been made before, many times over, only to collapse. History. Alioth was colonized. The crucible in which the Alliance was forged was Alioth, a system so rich in gas and mineral resources that early surveyors considered it a stellar El Dorado. When the Federation established its first colony on Alioth 5b in 2452, they gave the planet the less grandiose name of Fruitcake, as mineral deposits lay in the loamy soils as abundantly as raisins in cake. Later, commentators would reflect, bitterly, that the world was well named because everyone wanted a piece. A conflict over mining rights drew in the superpowers. Alioth's prosperity soon attracted corporations eager to support the developing system in exchange for a share of the profits. A dispute over rights quickly escalated into an armed conflict, prompting the Empire to dispatch a military force, ostensibly for the colonists' protection. The Federation also sent ships, but theirs were a response to the corporation's plea for aid. Unable to directly engage the Federal ships without sparking a war, the Empire covertly encouraged the Alioth colonists to renounce the Federation and accept Imperial protection, thus freeing the Empire to engage with the occupying Federal forces in sympathy with the will of the people. This marked the first of many incidents in which the people of Alioth were used to advance the agenda of another power. Federation-sponsored insurrection. In 2530, the Federation set out to undermine Imperial control of Alioth by exploiting local resentment of the governor. They covertly supported acts of protest and petty vandalism. Then, when the inevitable Imperial crackdown followed, stoked the fires of social unrest. A terrorist movement called the Quakers emerged, and the atrocities escalated. The years that followed saw a protracted and degrading series of proxy wars and cynical propaganda campaigns as the federal, imperial, and corporate powers all contended for Alioth. The system made an abortive attempt to establish its independence in 2617, resulting in a short-lived cooperation between the Empire and the Federation, neither of which were willing to allow this. The Revolution. In the early 4th millennium, both the Federation and the Empire had a presence in the Alioth system. Fruitcake, now known as Gordonworld, was a federal protectorate, while the Empire had earlier conducted terraforming experiments on the world of New California and also held gas mining platforms in the system. The federal corporations supplying New California had raised the prices of their goods several times in the previous years, and when they imposed yet another price hike, the planet's inhabitants revolted. In the insurrection that followed, rebels commandeered any available ships and headed out to the gas mining platforms, where they attacked the outpost's corporate employees. Alarmed, the Empire and the Federation dispatched ships to put down the rebellion, but were beaten back by a hastily assembled force made up of fighters from Alioth and, crucially, volunteers from nearby independent systems. Neither the Empire nor the Federation were able to gain a foothold, and eventually both forces had to withdraw. The Empire faced too many logistical problems fighting so far from home, while the Federation's efforts were undermined by public sympathy for the rebels. An alliance was brokered. The victory in Alioth had proven that independent systems working together could hold their own against the superpowers. It fell to pilot Mick Turner and scientist Meredith Argent to ride the wave of public spirit and propose a permanent alliance under whose aegis independent systems could enjoy freedom from imperial and federal interference. The alliance was founded in 3230, and in the next 2 decades, it expanded its membership to more than 20 systems, some defecting from the Federation and the Empire, others pledging as independents. Society. Many worlds, few rules, no overlords. The Alliance's Articles of Membership are designed to unite the member systems with strong, straightforward bonds that allow as much self-determination as possible. Membership guarantees mutual prosperity through guaranteed free trade and security through the Alliance Defense Force, while leaving much of the business of government to the individual members. The Alliance Assembly acts as a central arbitration committee, helping to settle disputes between member systems. It also oversees formal arrangements between members, such as treaties, research goals, and mutually agreed policies. As no one system can be allowed to carry more weight than another, the Assembly frequently finds itself bogged down in endless back-and-forth negotiations. Getting them to agree on anything is a task often compared to herding linglangs, notoriously ill-tempered carnivores from the Achenar system. A body of civil servants who remain uninvolved in politics handle most of the day-to-day administrative work that enables the Alliance to function. Conditional autonomy for member systems. Alliance members are required to subscribe to and uphold a code of human rights, and to have a democratically elected government. Citizens of any member state have a right of freedom of movement and residence within any other member state. Furthermore, all member systems are obliged to give immediate military assistance to any fellow member when necessary. Military. The Alliance Defense Force. While each Alliance member system maintains its own navy, all members are required to commit ships and crew to the Alliance Defense Force. This rapid response group usually remains within Alliance space, and its tasks vary from providing a beleaguered system with military assistance to evacuating settlements hit by natural disaster. A 6-member Council of Admirals oversees the Alliance Defense Force. It is accountable to the Assembly, but does not require its approval before taking action. This freedom of decision-making prevents urgent military action being delayed by tedious debate. Culture and values. Cooperation, mutual aid, tolerance, and respect. The values that bind the Alliance systems also hold true on an interpersonal level. Just as the different worlds of the Alliance formally recognize one another's legitimacy and value, individuals are generally reluctant to show prejudice against others and will band together to help those in genuine need. Diversity is strength. Members of the Alliance are not obliged to conform to what they consider the corporate saturation of federal culture or the status-obsessed posturing of the Imperials. Individual systems are encouraged to preserve and celebrate their own cultural identities. This approach results in a rich variety of artistic, literary, and dramatic output. Free to speak, free to protest. One curious cultural constant across the Alliance member systems is the way the citizens indulge their freedom to complain. They can criticize their governments without fear of repression, and they frequently do so. Previous experience of exploitation has left many citizens cynical, but possessed of a certain mordant humor and a willingness to take life as it comes. Diplomatic relations. The Federation. Alliance attitudes to the Federation vary sharply, depending on whether one is asking about the Federation's government or its citizenry. The government is seen as a hidebound relic, unable to arrest its slow decline into decadence, but the general populace are much more compassionately viewed. An Alliance citizen, proud of his or her own emancipation, is likely to have a rather condescending view of a federal citizen. They are characterized as ignorant dupes, kept satiated by mass-market entertainment and branded consumer goods. This is not seen as their fault, however. On the contrary, it is widely held that the Federation and the corporate barons deliberately keep the people in this servile state. The Alliance is more interested in enticing federal systems to join its union, thereby winning moral war, than in exacting vengeance for the wrongs of the past. There has been too much violence already. The Empire. To the Alliance, the Empire is anathema. With its monolithic culture, veneration of opulence, disdain for human rights and tolerance of slavery, it could not be further from the Alliance's values of mutual respect and freedom from exploitation. Yet, for all this, many Alliance members would rather deal with the Empire than the Federation. The common belief is that the Federation will always pretend to be something it is not. At least with the Empire, you know what you're dealing with. Most Alliance citizens view the emergence of a progressive movement within the Empire with cynicism. Everyone knows that the Empire is incapable of changing its ways. The whole Imperial social model is an imitation of the past. But some in the Alliance nevertheless welcome the ascension of the first female Emperor. The edifice may not be about to crumble, but such a profound change cannot be ignored. The Federation. Introduction. The Federation is the oldest of the galaxy's three superpowers, a vast geopolitical entity reaching out from the core system of Sol and encompassing a broad socio-economic spectrum. Among the myriad federal star systems, one can find extraordinary wealth, crushing poverty, and everything in between. By contrast with the Empire, which offers a social safety net in the form of state-sanctioned slavery, the poorest members of federal society have no safeguards and no way out. For them, life on the graffiti-stained streets is inescapable, and the gulf between their lives and those of the super-rich could not be more insurmountable. At its best, the Federation embodies the values of its founding nations: democracy, industry, and liberty. But federal society can also be competitive and unforgiving. Corporations wield too much power, politicians are often corrupt, and a sink-or-swim ethos prevails. History. The nations of Earth united in the aftermath of war. After the devastation of World War III, the United States of the Americas rose to become the planet's dominant nation. Over the following years, it gradually brought the other nations of the world under its aegis. Called at first the Federation of the USA, the expanding democracy was soon given the less exclusive title of the Federation. Humanity reached for the stars. When faster-than-light travel became a reality in the 22nd century, several terrestrial corporations competed fiercely to establish the first human colony in a new star system. Tau Ceti was the first system to be colonized, followed by Delta Pavonis, Beta Hydria, and Altair. In their wake, there followed a wild scramble of pioneering expeditions and colonial ventures. The first colony rebelled. The year 2161 saw a dispute between the colony of Tau Ceti III and the Federation Authority, centered on the colonists' repeated refusal to limit the damage they were inflicting on the alien ecosystem. Earth dispatched a fleet with orders to revoke the colony's charter. The colony responded by declaring independence. A military stalemate led to grudging compromise, and the Federal Accord resulted, granting the system rights and representation along with concomitant duties. The Federation, born on Earth, was now an association of star systems. The Birthright Wars gave corporations preferential treatment. Starting in 2621, a group of corporations subjected the federal government to over a century of unrelenting pressure. They demanded the right to buy up underexploited colonial land from its hereditary owners. Under the terms of the original charters, the land belonged to the colonists and their descendants, regardless of their ability to mine, farm, or otherwise exploit it, meaning that immense resources were lying untapped. The corporations argued that with the machinery, workforce, and fleets at their disposal, they could tap those resources. The Federation would be enriched, the original owners would be compensated, and everyone would be satisfied. The Federation bowed to pressure and allowed compulsory purchase of the family's land, albeit for far less than the expected sums. Outrage, rebellion, and, in one case, the defiant resettlement of an entire colony resulted. The Federation's detractors often point to this dark episode as indicative of its true nature, a mere administrative puppet bent to the will of rapacious corporations. Society. A federated democracy. The Federation's legislative body is made up of congressmen elected to represent their system or state. Apart from the oldest core systems such as Sol, which encompasses multiple states, each star system within the Federation is considered a single state. New colonies do not qualify for full Federation membership until and unless they fulfill the development objectives set down for them. With self-reliance comes representation. The federal government has its seat on Mars, which was terraformed in 2286. Congress was moved there from Earth in the early 3rd millennium. The executive branch is headed by an elected president with a fixed 8-year term. Constitutional rights obtain. The sovereign rights of all individuals are enshrined in the Constitution, which is a modified and streamlined version of the US Constitution, originally codified in the 18th century. The right to liberty underscores the absolute ban on slavery within the Federation and is a point of contention with the Empire. Corporate interests dominate. Although the Federation is loudly and proudly democratic, corporations still exercise tremendous influence over the democratic process, shaping citizens' choices through celebrity endorsement, lobbying, and occasionally outright corruption. The government is notoriously reluctant to curb corporate activity. The typical question in Congress is not whether a given policy will favor corporate interests, but which ones it will favor. Competition between corporations for Congress support can lead to a deadlock in the government. Military. The Federal Navy. The Federation has maintained a battle fleet since the days of the first federal colony, which was established in the Tau Ceti system. Its official mandate is to protect shipping and defend the borders of federal space, but it has also frequently been deployed against the Federation's own rebellious citizens. At first, the Federation's member systems were required to contribute the required ships, making the mustering process a cumbersome one. But following the Birthright Wars, corporations were chartered to produce centralized fleets, which made for a far more efficient system. The Naval Shipyards and Training Academy were originally based in the Anlave system, but the academy has since been moved to the custom world of Navy Central in Eta Cassiopeia. The Navy benefited from massive investment following the forced sell-off of colonial land in the Birthright Wars, during which it was wielded against the colonists in a bitterly resented move. When the Thargoids were first encountered in 2849, the Navy was boosted once again in fear of the alien threat, and a further bolstering followed in 2867, in the aftermath of what were believed to be Thargoid attacks. Governor Raul Santorini championed heavy cuts to the Navy budget in 3022, which were not reversed until President Varian Scott came to power in 3144. Scott talked up the Thargoid threat, again increasing funding to the Navy and removing the requirement for military actions to be approved by congressional vote. Land forces. In addition to the rank and file, the Federation still enjoys the loyal service of special military divisions, such as the Gurkha Regiment, who have served since the days of Earth. Keeping up long-standing traditions such as this is an important link to the past for federal citizens. Culture and values. If you want to eat, you have to work. The Federation has no room for freeloaders. It has nurtured the core frontier values of self-reliance and entrepreneurship since its inception, and respects the self-made citizen. This insistence upon paying your way and pulling your weight also applied, notoriously, to the process whereby new colonies were established. Until a given colony was able to fulfill the development goals set down for it by the Federation, it could only ever be a dependency with no voice of its own. Given that the Federation's assigned goals could vary wildly from one colony to the next, this requirement frequently chafed with the colonists. While the Federation maintained that it was simply exercising flexibility, since no two worlds were the same, some colonies were tempted away to the Empire by the promise of being recognized as sovereign without having to jump through arbitrary hoops. Corporations took humanity into space. The Federation has never forgotten the role played by private enterprise in the initial migration from Earth. Corporations enjoy substantial freedom and influence under the Federation, so much so that it often seems they are the powers truly running the show. Federal citizens can be as passionately loyal to their corporations as they would be to a family or clan group, and it is common for successive generations of a given family to serve the same corporation. Harvest the limitless riches of space, but respect non-human life. The Federation and the Empire have hugely differing views on the primacy of humanity in the cosmos. While the Federation insists that its colonies treat indigenous non-human life with care, the Empire typically takes a more human-centric approach. This attitude has allowed the Empire to poach several developing Federation colonies who felt themselves hamstrung by ecological regulations. Wealth is freedom. Federal citizens actively embrace corporate culture, expressing their identity through brand choices and media consumption. Diplomatic relations. The Empire. In 2292, a group of colonists established a settlement on Akanar 6D, chosen for its remoteness. The original intent was merely to live free from interference, but autocrat Henson Duval rapidly took control of the colony and had himself proclaimed emperor. The Federation attempted military reprisals, partly due to the nascent empire's insistence on independence, but faced a harder fight than they had expected and were held at bay. Over the next 50 years, the Empire expanded to many other worlds. The Federation's relationship with the Empire is one of entrenched mistrust, stemming from irreconcilable ideological differences, mollified somewhat by the corporations, which have a presence in both territories, and thus act as a stabilizing influence. Outright hostilities between the powers, when they occur at all, are usually conducted through proxy forces. The Alliance. In 3228, the federally aligned corporations supplying the Alioth system attempted to raise their prices, leading to a citizen rebellion. Several independent systems assisted the rebels. Neither galactic superpower was able to suppress the revolt. The Empire was too far away to intervene effectively, whereas the Federation was hampered by unexpected public sympathy for the rebels. The Alliance of Independent Systems, founded on Alioth in 3230, drew in new members over the next 20 years. Some were already independent, while others defected from the Federation or Empire. In order to keep more worlds from defecting, the Federation was forced to reform the process whereby colonies could achieve full federal membership. So far, it has only managed to slow the loss of worlds to the Alliance, and has yet to tempt any back.